I started this project by breaking down the white oak boards I used for the shelves on the bookshelf, and I picked up this 4/4 white oak from my local lumber dealer, Asheville Hardware, and luckily it was already S3S or surfaced on 3 sides. And this meant that I could just cut the boards to rough length at the miter saw, joint one edge at the jointer, and then rip them to width at the table saw. And when ripping them, I just removed as little material as possible, really just enough to be left with a clean edge on both sides of each board. After cutting down the shelves, I started laying them out to make up the panel sizes I'd need for the bookshelves. And these shelves get narrower as they go up the bookshelf to match the angled front leg, so each panel size was slightly different. And out of just sheer luck, I was able to match up the pieces with almost no waste, usually only about 1/4 of an inch of extra width on each shelf. Next, I laid out locations for dominoes, which I used for alignment. And since these boards were already milled down to about 7/8 of an inch thick, I really didn't want to remove much more material when flattening them after the glue up. And dominoes were really helpful for this, but biscuits or dowels of course would also work as well. After cutting in the mortises, I could glue up the panels, which required just about every clamp I had. You really can never have enough clamps. And that was because I was gluing up 6 of these shelves in total since I was building 2 of these bookshelves. So to help with this, I ended up using this Titebond quick and thick wood glue on the first few panels, which only required the shelves to stay in the clamps for about 15 minutes. And quick and thick also dries clear, which is a really nice feature for this kind of panel glue up. And this is not sponsored or anything, I just happened to pick up a bottle of this glue to try out and really liked the way it worked in this application, and I'll link to it in the video description if you want to check it out. Anyway, after letting the glue dry, I removed the shelves from the clamps and scraped off any glue squeeze out. And I should mention that this shelf had regular Titebond since I ran out of that quick and thick, hence the non-clear squeeze out. After removing them from the clamps, I did let the panels cure overnight and then ran them through the planer the following day to clean them up. And having a 20-inch planer is definitely a luxury here, as I could run all the shelves through at full width. And speaking of luxuries, I also ran the shelves through my drum sander to further clean up the surface. And this kind of 1-2 punch of planer then drum sander can take a board like this from very rough to almost finish ready in just a few minutes, and it's definitely a huge boost to my efficiency. Next, I ripped some strips from a few of the extra white oak boards, and I used these as a back edge for the shelves. And not only would these strips help just keep items from sliding off the back of the shelves, but they'd also help keep the shelves flat over time. So to attach these strips to the edge of the shelves, I cut in a rabbet using my Dado stack at the table saw, which would provide an extremely strong bond between the shelves and the strip. Finally, I could cut the shelves to their final width and length again at the table saw. And I ripped the shelves to width, making sure to account for the differing widths, and then pulled out my Rockler crosscut sled to cut the shelves to final length. And this crosscut sled really came in handy on this project, as you'll see, and I'll link to it in the video description if you want to check it out. Unfortunately, I accidentally cut the first shelf 1/2 inch too short, which really came back to haunt me later on, but we'll get to that a little bit later. After getting the shelves cut to their final size, I sanded them up to 120 grit prior to gluing the strips onto the shelves. I also went ahead and added a roundover to the front edge of the shelf and the top edge of the back strip, since it would have been next to impossible to do this after the glue up. Finally, I could get the strips glued onto the shelves, and I once again used most of my clamps during this process, and I just made sure the strip was aligned with the shelf and then clamped it in place, checking it for square after adding the clamps. So with that, the shelves were pretty much good to go for the time being, so I moved on to the lower cabinet, which makes up the kind of bottom section of this bookshelf. And the goal with these cabinets is to provide an area to store my son's toys in our den, which is where these bookshelves will end up. And I plan to pick up some plastic totes to fit in these drawers to help keep things organized, or at least that's the hope. We'll see if that actually happens in real life. Anyway, I built the cabinet out of red oak plywood since I'd be spraying it black, and white oak plywood is much harder to come by and much more expensive. And I decided to add some hardwood edge banding to the plywood since I had some scraps left over that would work really well for this. And I used 1/8 inch thick edge banding on the top and bottom edges of the side panels, and I milled the edge banding down at the planer, drum sander, and bandsaw. After cutting the edge banding pieces to rough size, I glued it to the edges of the side panels with the help of some Rockler bandy clamps. And these things are incredibly effective for hardwood edge banding, and I always seem to need more than I already have on hand. After the glue dried, I trimmed the ends of the edge banding with a flush trim saw and then flushed up the edges with a trim router, spiral bit, and this little lipper attachment from FastCap. And this is a super inexpensive attachment and allows you to run your trim router on its side, making it perfect for flushing up hardwood edge banding like this. And this is by far the fastest way I've found to trim hardwood edge banding, and it's also the safest for the plywood in my opinion. I've tried using a block plane, but I always seem to end up digging into the plywood veneer when I get really close to the surface, plus a block plane is just much slower than a router. After flushing up the edge banding on the top and bottom edge of the side panels, I added some thicker 3/4 inch thick edge banding to the front edge, once again calling on the bandy clamps, and I used this thicker edge banding on the front edges of the panels so that I could add a heavy chamfer to the front edge of the cabinet without exposing the plywood edges. And I repeated the same process on the top and bottom cabinet panels and then trimmed them all flush after the glue dried. Once the edge banding was trimmed flush, I came back and sanded the inside faces of the panel just to make sure everything was nice and smooth before cutting the joinery for the cabinet. And for the joinery, I decided to go with rabbets, and I cut them once again using my dado stack at the table saw. I set the height of the dado stack using some setup bars, setting the height to 1/2 inch, and I used a sacrificial piece of plywood on the fence so that I could butt the blade right up against the fence, and the dado stack width was set for 3/4 inch plywood, which is actually 23/32 of an inch thick. After confirming the fit on a piece of scrap, I cut the rabbets into the top and bottom edges of the side panels, and I also went ahead and cut a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch rabbet on the back edge of all the cabinet panels to house the cabinet back. With all those rabbets cut into the panels, I could go ahead and get the cabinet carcasses glued up, which went really smoothly. And rabbets are pretty much self-squaring as long as you cut them square, and you just need to make sure to close up any small gaps with some clamps. And I definitely tend to go overboard when clamping cabinets like this, but I did end up with gap-free joints. After the glue dried, I removed the clamps and then flushed up one corner with my low-angle jack plane, and it was just slightly proud, and the plane made really quick work of it. On the second cabinet glue up, I decided to try these Rockler corner clamping jigs, and they did seem to help keep things aligned a little better than just the parallel clamps, probably because the panel alignment was actually referencing off of my assembly table rather than me having to align them manually. The last piece for the cabinets was the back panel, and I cut these from some of that scrap packing plywood that I've had hanging around. And one side of this plywood looks fine, and the back of the cabinet will never be seen, so I figured why not just use it up. I attached the back panel with a few 3/4 inch screws, and then the cabinet was done for the time being. The next thing to work on was the leg assemblies, which run the entire length of the sides of the bookshelf, and the entire weight of the bookshelf rides on these leg assemblies, so I figured I'd make them from some 8/4 stock just to make sure they were nice and strong. I picked up this gorgeous piece of white oak, also from Asheville Hardware, and it was exactly the size I needed for the leg assemblies for the two bookshelves, with just enough of an offcut for the 1/8 inch thick edge banding. I cut the board in half at the miter saw, jointed one edge, and then ripped it into strips at the table saw. Next, I cut the shorter stretcher pieces to size from some of the longer pieces at the miter saw before squaring up all of the parts. And I like to make parts like this as short as possible before squaring them up, as I typically end up with straighter pieces this way, and I can also remove less material. Speaking of squaring up the parts, next I squared up one face and one edge on the pieces at the jointer, and then ran them through the planer to bring the other faces into parallel. While I'm planing, let's talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Powermatic, the gold standard. So as you guys know, I've added a bunch of Powermatic tools to my shop over the past few years, and they have been total game changers for my woodworking. The added power of the bandsaw, the extra width and gorgeous surface finish from the planer and jointer, and the precision of the drum sander, just to name a few, have been absolutely amazing, and I know these tools will last me for many, many years to come. So to learn more about these machines and the rest of my Powermatic tools, check out the links in the video description below, and thanks to Powermatic for sponsoring this week's video and supporting what I do. After milling, I cut the pieces to their final length at the miter saw, starting with the back legs, and since these had two 90-degree ends, I could just set up a quick stop block and cut them to length. Next, I set the miter saw to 5 degrees and cut the front legs to length, once again setting up a stop block. And these front legs have a 5-degree angle on both ends, and the angles are cut parallel to each other. I also cut the bottom stretcher to length off camera, and this piece has one square end and one end with that 5-degree angle. To determine the length of the top stretcher, I clamped up the leg assembly temporarily and then marked out the length based on the actual size. And I could have pulled this dimension from my 3D model, but it usually ends up being a lot more accurate to mark the length based on your actual pieces. Finally, I could set up one more stop block based on my mark on the top stretcher and cut all of the top stretchers to length. After cutting those top stretchers, I temporarily clamped the leg assembly together and it looked great, nice and square with a subtle tilt to that front leg. While the leg assembly was clamped together, I marked out locations for dominoes, which I used for joinery here. That said, there are a ton of options for joinery, including dowels if you want to use the same type of method I did, or half laps, which would have been a little bit more complicated. And my buddy Chris Salamone from Four Eyes built a similar bookshelf a little while back and did use half laps, and I'll link to his video if you want to see that method. Anyway, with the domino locations marked out, I could cut the mortises into the pieces, and I ended up using two 8mm by 50mm dominoes per joint, and this made for a super strong leg assembly. Also, I absolutely love my T-track assembly table for projects like this. Being able to create a quick clamping jig for holding the parts while I cut the dominoes was just so convenient. Once I had cut all the mortises, I could glue up the leg structures, which went smoothly, and I just made sure not to use too much glue just to avoid a ton of squeeze out, and I also used some of the angled offcuts to help clamp the angled front legs. And it's a good idea to always save some of these offcuts when working on angled pieces like this, as they can really come in handy. Alright, so remember how I mentioned that I had cut my shelves half an inch shorter than my cabinet? Well, now I had to come up with a solution for that problem. And after thinking about it for a while, I figured that cutting a 1/4 inch deep dado into the leg assemblies would be the easiest way to accomplish this, and it would also have the added benefit of giving the cabinets a little bit more support rather than just relying on a few screws to attach them to the legs. So first I started by marking out exactly where I needed to cut the dadoed section on the legs, just to avoid accidentally cutting them in the wrong spot, and I would definitely recommend this, especially on something with angles like this. Next, I set up my widest dado stack since I was going to be clearing out a lot of material, and then set the fence to the location I needed to start the dado. I set the blade height to 1/4 inch, since removing 1/4 inch on each leg assembly would give me my 1/2 inch of total width, and with that I could cut in the first dado, establishing one end of the larger dado. After that, I moved the fence to cut the other end of the dado, cut it on both pieces, and then I could start clearing out the area in between the two dados. And this went pretty smoothly, except that I didn't support one end of the leg assembly when clearing out the first dado, and this meant that the leg assembly started to kind of sag as I was cutting, and this resulted in a small gap between the leg assembly and the cabinet on this first piece, but it pretty much disappeared with the black cabinet against the clear-coated oak legs. Luckily, I figured this out on the first leg assembly and was able to use a 1/2 inch strip of plywood as a spacer on the rest of the legs to avoid this. And up to this point, you've seen me working on 2 of the 4 leg assemblies, since again I'm building 2 of these bookshelves, and next I needed to work on the other leg assemblies, which angle in the opposite direction. Luckily, I could just set the fence on the crosscut sled to match the 5-degree angle on the front legs and cut the dados using the same technique. After cutting the dados on all the leg assemblies, I could clamp them to the cabinets to test the fit, and thankfully they fit really well, and it was really exciting to start to see the bookshelves coming together. With the legs clamped in place on the cabinets, I went ahead and marked out locations for screws, pre-drilled the holes, and then drove in some 1.25" screws. Next, I could work on getting the shelves attached to the leg structures, and I decided to use pocket holes for this. I added 3 pocket holes on each side of each shelf, 1 at the front leg and 2 at the back leg, with 1 going through the shelf and 1 going through the back strip. I fit the shelf temporarily to mark the pocket hole locations, and then drilled the pocket holes using my marks to line up the shelf with the jig. After drilling the holes, I clamped the shelf in place, used some spacer blocks I cut to set the spacing between the shelves, and then used 1.25" pocket screws to attach the shelves to the legs. And I made sure to use pocket screws with finer threads, which are designed for hardwoods, to avoid splitting the legs, and I could have definitely used longer screws, but these are honestly plenty strong as is. And I just worked my way up the bookshelf using the same 12.5 inch spacers between each shelf, and then repeated the process on the other bookshelf. With that, the main structure of the bookshelf was done, so I could move on to making the drawers for the lower cabinet. And once again, I used my favorite Bloom undermount drawer slides, and I have an entire video on making drawers for these types of drawer slides, so I won't go into too much detail here. The one difference on these drawers versus the drawers I've built for these slides in the past was that I decided to go with a 1/2 inch thick drawer bottom rather than 1/4 inch thick, since these drawers are just so big. This doesn't really change much on the drawer construction, besides needing to cut a wider groove in the drawer box front, back, and sides to accept the 1/2 inch panel. After cutting the grooves on the inside face of the drawer box parts, I notched out an area on the backs of the drawers to accept the drawer slides, and then I could get the drawer boxes assembled. And as usual on these types of drawers, I went with smaller pocket holes using the Craig micro drill guide in my pocket hole jig. And these smaller pocket holes work much better in 1/2 inch thick material, and I definitely recommend them for 1/2 inch drawer boxes like these. I assembled the drawer boxes with a little glue and some 3/4 inch pocket screws, making sure to clamp them together to avoid the parts slipping around while I drove in the screws. And the nice thing about using screws here is that you can remove the clamps immediately after adding the screws, since they provide the clamping pressure while the glue dried. Next, I went ahead and got the drawer fronts cut to size and added the handle cutouts, which have become a favorite of mine lately. And in case you missed it, I made a template for this handle cutout during my dual Murphy bed project, and I've used this same template a bunch of times since that project. So I centered the template on the drawer fronts, traced the outline of the handle cutout, and then rough cut it with my jigsaw since these drawer fronts wouldn't fit on the bandsaw. Next, I attached the template to the drawer front with some CA glue and painter's tape, and then flushed up the handle cutout to the template at the router table using a small spiral flush trim bit. To avoid the blowout on the top edge of the handle cutout, I tried holding a backer block against the drawer front while I routed, and I found that just routing slowly will help prevent pretty much all of that blowout that I was experiencing. Next, I got the Bloom slides installed using this Rockler undermount drawer slide jig, which makes this a super simple process. I set the offset on the jig to match the 3/4 inch thick drawer fronts, clamped the drawer slide and jig in place, and then used a self-centering drill bit to pre-drill the holes. After attaching the slides, I drilled the holes for the Bloom slides in the drawer boxes using another Rockler jig, and then I could attach the clips on the bottom of the drawers and drop the drawer into place. And these slides just function beautifully and have a ton of adjustability built in, and I definitely recommend them for any kind of higher end furniture piece. Next, I got the drawer fronts attached, and I used a few spacers just to help create an even spacing around the fronts, and then pre-drilled holes from inside the drawer boxes and added a few screws to attach the drawer fronts. And with that, everything was assembled, so I could then disassemble it all and move on to getting everything ready for finishing. So I started by chamfering the edges of the cabinets, adding a smaller chamfer to the sides and back edges, then a heavier chamfer to the front edge with that thicker hardwood edge banding. Next, I could work on the leg assemblies, and first I worked on chamfering the edge where I cut that dado too deep on one of the legs, and I used my spoke shave for this. And the idea was to add a heavy chamfer in the shallower area so that there would be an even shadow line across that entire edge. I also decided to add a round over to the leg assemblies, and I really should have done this before cutting in the dados. And I didn't think about it at the time, but these dados basically made it impossible to use my router table for this, which would have been much faster and given me much better results. And anytime you add an edge profile like this, it means lots of hand sanding to clean up that edge. And I think I spent a solid 4 hours sanding all of these leg assemblies and then the drawer boxes, just to give you an idea of how much time this process takes. And I'm definitely thankful for some audiobooks during these kind of tasks. The last pieces to work on were the drawer fronts, and I just added a light chamfer to them to make the handle cutouts a little bit more comfortable on the hand, and then I hand sanded those chamfers off camera. With that, I could finally get to spraying on some finish, and as I mentioned, I used a black polyurethane for the cabinets, and this is the same finish I used on my home bar project and my live edge bed, and I just really love the finished look. It's a one-step finish since it's a tinted polyurethane, and it just sprays on really nice, and I'll link to it in the video description in case you're interested. Next, I sprayed on a water-based polyurethane on the rest of the parts, and luckily I recently picked up a second gun for my HVLP system so that I could dedicate one gun to this black finish, and this made it really easy to swap between the two finishes. I applied 3 coats of finish in total, sanding with 320 grit after the second coat. With the finish applied, all that was left to do was put everything back together, first attaching the leg assemblies to the cabinets, then reinstalling the drawers, then finally adding the shelves to the legs. And with everything put back together, I could call this project finished. So if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and get subscribed and ring that little notification bell so you don't miss any of my future project videos. And while you're at it, why not go ahead and check out this video of mine that YouTube thinks you'll enjoy. Alright, I think that's it, so thanks for watching y'all, and until next time, happy building.